Vietnam is increasingly becoming attractive towards investors in APEC. Lessons from startups' failures and towards a healthy startup ecosystem. Hello and welcome to another edition of Bizline, the special economic magazine on VTV International. I am Hainam from Hanoi, and first we have a look at some economic highlights over the past week. On November 20th, in a closing statement after meetings in Peru, leaders of 21-country Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation or APEC group said, "We reaffirm our commitment to keep our markets open and to fight against all forms of protectionism." The APEC Summit 2016 successfully concluded with the approval of the Lima Declaration of Free Trade Area of the Asia-Pacific and the APEC Services Competitiveness Roadmap. Also at the event, Vietnamese State President Trần Đại Quang confirmed Vietnam's desire and determination to contribute to APEC development, stating that hosting the APEC Summit 2017 will be the center of Vietnam's foreign affairs activities. Besides the Philippines and Singapore, Vietnam is increasingly becoming an attractive destination for CEOs in APEC member economies. Half of CEOs taking part in a recent survey said they intend to expand investments in these countries in the coming year. The results were released by the multinational professional services network PricewaterhouseCoopers. CEOs also said that Vietnam needs to improve internet speeds and promote a digital economy in order to enhance regional connectivity. This is even more important than investing in large-scale commercial projects or developing infrastructure in less developed areas. Eurocharm Vietnam, in collaboration with the EU-Vietnam Business Network, launched the Eurocharm Central Vietnam Business Forum in Da Nang Central City. The forum is dedicated to discussing the economy and business opportunities in Da Nang and the provinces of Quảng Nam and Thừa Thiên Huế. The forum also tackled tax incentives and investment promotion measures that are being carried out to attract more foreign investment to these provinces. In a spirit of business and government dialogue, this event is the first of its kind in Central Vietnam, a region highly regarded for its potential for business, trade and investment development. Also during this event, Eurocharm launched its Central Regional Office, which will begin operations in January 2017. The Steering Committee for Economic Inspection in 2017 was officially established and will be led by Minister of Planning and Investment Nguyễn Chí Dũng. 12 other members of the committee include representatives of the General Statistics Office, Ministries of Defense, Public Security, Health, and the Taxation Department, among others. The areas for inspection include overview of businesses, labor and wages, results of production and business, IT application, access to capital, and specialist information on businesses. Data collection will be divided into two phases with surveys on businesses, foreign companies' offices, administrative institutions, associations, and so on. Preliminary results of the inspection will be released in December 2017 and the official report published in the third quarter of 2018. Vietnam is unlikely to meet the 10% export growth target for this year, according to Minister of Industry and Trade Trần Tuấn Anh. The General Department of Customs reported that total export value in the first 10 months of this year reached nearly $144 billion, a year-on-year increase of 7%. One reason explaining Vietnam's failure is changes in key export markets, which have reduced demands and prices. The decline of China's economy has also affected global trade. Other countries with similar export structures as Vietnam have also increased exports, resulting in tougher competition for Vietnamese goods. In contrast to optimistic predictions earlier this year, Vietnamese rice exports are likely to plunge. If rice exports in the last 2 months of this year remain below 400,000 tons, the country's total volume for 2016 will reach only 5 million tons, a 7-year record low. If the predicted fall in rice exports become a reality, this year's rice exports will decrease by $1.5 million, a 25% fall compared with last year. Notably, while Vietnamese rice faces difficulties, Indian and Thai rice exports are thriving. India is leading the world in rice exports with 8 million tons in the first 9 months of this year, while Thailand is the second with 7 million tons. We just take a look back at some of the economic highlights over the past week. Now let's move on with a discussion on the culture of failure among Vietnamese startups in our crosstalk. Vietnam is attempting to build a healthy startup ecosystem where the culture of failure has been built and welcomed in the country, enabling young entrepreneurs to flourish at an early startup stage where everybody can fail easily. So how have startups dealt with failures? Are there any lessons learned? And how do startup owners manage to sustain their business once the startups grow big? We'll look for the answers of those questions with Mr. Blake Nichols, Director of Enterprise Network of the Vietnam Oregon Initiative, who will share with us some stories and also experiences that he has dealt with. But first, let's take a look at the following.
Sink or swim is probably the most frequently asked question to startups. But the dream wears off, the reality hits. 2015 marked a new era for its startup community as it reached their record high of 94,000 businesses established. At the same time, however, nearly 70% went disruption. Meanwhile, on a global scale, 9 out of 10 startups fail, according to Forbes. Experts have pointed out several main reasons for startup failures, such as doing it for the wrong reasons, insufficient capital, location, overexpansion, or the lack of IT skills. Topping the list may be insufficient capital or efficient use of capital or corporate management. But there are more key factors that weigh down a business. So what are the key factors for keeping a new business afloat in the waters of the entrepreneurial sea?
Mr. Blake Nichols, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
It is well known that the vast majority of startups fail. So what do you think about the reasons behind their failure?
There's actually not just one thing that causes startup companies to fail, but I would say probably one of the most common is that startup companies, they don't pay attention to their customers. I think that a startup company needs to start up based off of a need that customers want. You see so many startup companies, they have this great idea and they run out into the marketplace with their new idea, but they haven't done enough research of their customers to understand if anyone really needs that thing. Another thing is companies oftentimes are initially driven by 1 or 2 champions. These are people who understand the vision of the company and they know what goals they need to set in place to make this company reach their vision. And when I say vision, I mean the purpose of the company. They want to have a certain number of customers or a percentage of the market. Companies need to focus on that vision. The 1 or 2 champions of the company need to push it forward. And if you don't have those champions, and if something happens during that time that maybe takes one of them away or changes their vision, I think that they can run into considerable problems.
So let's talk about the reasons of failure. Do you think it's the management skill or the idea, or what are the main reasons for failure?
There's a lot of them. I think that, yes, as companies start small, like I said, there's 1 or 2 champions that are pushing it forward. They understand the vision, they've shared it, they've been there from the beginning. When people told them they were not going to succeed, they were there. But as companies grow bigger and get more complicated and they hire more people, it gets very difficult to hold tight to that vision. Another issue is planning the company. I see a lot of companies, they'll have an idea, they'll run out there, but they haven't done full planning. They haven't looked at a growth strategy. They haven't looked at how they're going to track their finances, their cash inflows and outflows. So I think that can set them up for some challenges in the future. Yeah, I think also holding tight to your customers and staying in touch with them and understanding what they need is absolutely crucial to success. I'm a marketing guy, and I think that that's the most important aspect of a company's success, especially a startup company.
1 year after successfully garnering $5.5 million worth of foreign investment capital, the Cafe, a chain of fusion cafes based in Hanoi, has raised its charter capital to $10 million from a venture capital fund in Hong Kong. Meanwhile, its CEO, Dao Jiang, resigned from her post last October the 25th. What happens to startups after they received investment, and how do they build trust with their stakeholders? These questions were answered by Dao Jiang at a forum recently held in Hanoi.
Khi mà bạn được đầu tư ấy, thì các nhà đầu tư cũng muốn bạn hoàn toàn thuộc về họ và ngày đêm bạn chỉ làm việc cho họ. Có rất nhiều mong muốn không làm được tại vì là mình luôn phải đặt cái lợi ích của nhà đầu tư lên trên đầu. Quá nhiều áp lực cho mình để mình đạt được những cái chỉ tiêu của họ và mình cũng đạt được, nhưng mà nó có những cái trả giá. Cái đấy thì chả có thể nào biết được trừ phi bạn đã trải nghiệm.
Changes with decision making is one of the biggest differences between a startup's operations before investment and after. It is estimated that about 80% of pre-investment time is taken up by product development. Afterwards, a lot of time is usually spent managing relationships with investors.
Mọi người hơi hay nhầm tưởng rằng là gọi được vốn đầu tư đã là thành công. Thế nhưng mà trên thực tế, cái sốc lớn nhất của các bạn khi khởi nghiệp là sau khi gọi vốn được rồi thì các bạn, và sau khi làm được xong sản phẩm rồi, các bạn mới nhận ra bây giờ mình bắt đầu có số 0, tức là cuộc chơi mới bắt đầu.
Entrepreneurs should understand themselves. You know, are they built to run big companies, or are they just an idea person, or are they someone that actually are good at starting new businesses?
The possibility that the founders will eventually start another project is very high. So should we take startups' failures so seriously?
Well, I think that's a difficult question because I think, yes, they should be taken seriously. Look, startup companies are just one or a few people who are risking a lot. They're risking their network, they're risking money, they're risking their reputation. And so if their startup fails, that can be quite considerable. But it's worth it because, look, every single failure is an opportunity to learn something new. And as companies fail, they learn what to do, what not to do next time. I don't think that companies should focus on the failure, though. So what I mean by that is sometimes companies will fail, but then they will be so nervous about losing more money or hurting their reputation more that they're unwilling to try again. And so, yeah, I think it's important that keep trying.
Usually foreign venture funds will look at the potential of development of a startup rather than looking at the scale of a company when they first chose to invest in. And however, once accepted by the funds, startups owners are under the pressure to meet investors' expectations while maintaining ownership power at the same time. So do you have any recommendations?
You know, you can look at both sides because venture capital companies are for-profit companies. They want to, so they're going to do their best to try to set tough goals for the startup companies and work with them to meet those goals. I do understand that sometimes those goals can be unrealistic, to be honest. And startup companies, they need to be really careful about where they source their funding. I've been talking a lot about how these startup companies need a strong vision. And sometimes the way that they fund their companies goes along with that vision. Whether they want to focus on employees, they want to focus on product line development, things like that, they need to find a source of funding that will support that. Venture capital companies is just one of the ways to support your startup company. And so that needs to be considered early on. Now, venture capital companies, they do look for companies that they believe that will bring them more money. And so oftentimes they invest in companies that have already established themselves in the market to some degree. So those companies are a little bit ahead because the venture capital company oftentimes will follow their lead. As long as those venture capital companies and the startup work together, then it can lead to some very good things. Startups can utilize the venture capital companies for advice. They can use them for assistance to find additional workers, so human resources, and other resource development.
Having invested in over 50 startups in countries such as the US, Singapore, and Indonesia, Eddie, a Singaporean investor, is now eyeing the Vietnamese market. He got the chance to learn about Vietnamese startups to TechFest, an annual startup event organized on a global scale in the entrepreneurial hub of Hanoi.
In terms of investments that we make, we are writing first checks of up to a few $100,000. But most of our work comes after investing in the startup, where we are prepared to spend a couple of hours per week to work with the startup.
As a representative of the Vietnamese startup incubator Hatch, Phạm Quốc Đạt recognized that the biggest concern of foreign investors is to seek collaboration opportunities with their startups and give support for preventing risks.
Thường thì nhà đầu tư quốc tế khi đầu tư vào những công ty tại Việt Nam, họ sẽ muốn những cái đối tác ở tại Việt Nam đầu tư cùng, có thể là từ những cái vườn ươm, có thể là đồng đầu tư cùng với những nhà đầu tư thiên thần hoặc là những quỹ đầu tư ở tại Việt Nam để giúp họ tránh cái rủi ro đó.
According to the Ministry of Science and Technology, so far 250 investment contracts have been announced for Vietnamese startups from domestic and foreign funds. Opportunities to meet and interact with internationally successful investors are one of the things that the Vietnamese startups seek out so that they can expand their businesses.
Another problem for owners is to manage the significant increasing amount of capital inflow once they're successfully calling for investment. So what scenarios are most likely to occur?
There can be a number of things that can happen. Startup companies are a collection of successes and failures every day. But as long as you have some things that are holding through, you can succeed. It's not easy to run a startup. And when it's growing, it's extremely difficult. But once you add complications, once you add, maybe you're a manufacturing company and you open 3 or 4 new factories that are managed, and pretty soon you're managing thousands of people sometimes, it can get very complicated and people start having to make decisions without assessing whether it's in line with the vision, and that's when things can start falling apart. You know, when you talk about increasing the amount of startup capital, that is something that they really need to be careful with, because if they grow too quickly, they can put out poor quality products perhaps, they can grow to the wrong locations, they can charge the wrong price, they can forget their customers, they can shift their view on something else, ignore their customers, and have major problems. Again, customers are the key. If you want your company to be sustainable, you always need to focus on those customers. They're the ones who will buy your products.
So are capital management and corporate management the biggest issues for startups once they grow big?
They are 2 big issues, absolutely. That's why it's so important for someone to really understand finance when they're working with startup companies. Someone needs to sit down and say, okay, this project here will pay off this amount of money on this date, but this other project will pay off a higher amount at a later date. Things like that. And so being able to select those projects, those ways of allocating finance is very difficult, but it's essential to a startup's success. The way that a startup is going to choose those projects is striking a balance between short-term projects and long-term projects. Another issue, as you said, is corporate management. And again, the managers need to be held together by a shared vision. But that vision, especially with startups, can be a little bit flexible based on what opportunities can be found. I think that's something else that happened with Cafe.
Cái số 1 là làm sao có một cái cơ chế để giúp các nhà đầu tư mạo hiểm họ nhanh chóng họ tham gia vào cái thị trường Việt Nam, cũng như họ có thể thoái vốn khỏi thị trường Việt Nam một cách dễ dàng và nhanh chóng.
Các nhóm khởi nghiệp thì các em rất khó tiếp cận được các nguồn vốn. Còn đối với các đề án, các cái dự án mà với cấp quốc gia thì các nhóm khởi nghiệp rất khó tiếp cận với những quan chức, gần như không tìm được kết nối.
Tôi rất là kỳ vọng có thể thay đổi được các cái nền tảng thanh toán trực tuyến, các nền tảng về tự do thương mại trên trực tuyến, các cái quy định và các cái điều kiện về vấn đề pháp lý để cho chúng tôi vững tin để có thể đầu tư và phát triển trong tương lai.
Tôi nghĩ cái quan trọng hơn hết là hỗ trợ về mặt kiến thức. Tức là làm sao để chúng ta tạo ra những môi trường để các doanh nghiệp khởi nghiệp của chúng ta có sự cọ sát quốc tế.
Relook at the investment law so that to make it a bit more attractive for foreign investors to come here to actually commit funds into Vietnam, because a lot of times startups have to register themselves outside of Vietnam in order to get the funds from the region, for example Singapore or Hong Kong.
Khởi nghiệp sáng tạo vào trong một cái khung hỗ trợ chính thức của nhà nước thì điều đó 844 cộng với những cái chính sách đang được chuẩn bị thông qua, đang được trình Quốc hội thì nó sẽ tạo ra những cái điều kiện mà tôi nghĩ nó là một cái cơ hội để khởi nghiệp của Việt Nam có thể bùng nổ.
Some people think that startup is also a kind of business that need special kind of support, special kind of consultancy and community advocacy. So how can we bring those initiatives to them?
Startup companies are a type of business, absolutely. And look, there is such a strong ecosystem in Vietnam. I'm really proud of the ecosystem here. It's supporting the companies. I also see all of these great laws being passed by the Vietnamese government. I also see international players coming into this market and helping these startup companies succeed. Vietnam was recently called the next Silicon Valley, and I think that that's fantastic, and I agree. There's all of these companies that want to invest in these startups here, and I'm really impressed with the young people here.
So Resolution 35 by the government on developing the business community and the draft law on SME support also officially recognize startup as a new economic entities. So how is government determination to support startups reflected in your opinion?
I think that the government is excited about the international recognition of startups in Vietnam. And I'm talking about all sectors, but I think the most excitement has been around technology sector. And I think that the Vietnamese government's goal of, I think it's 1 million startups within before 2020 is difficult but motivating. And I think that there's a number of organizations. I know the Ministry of Science and Technology are working, or I think they've funded Vietnam Silicon Valley organization, and they're helping push forward a lot of this innovation.
VietNamTrip is currently the oldest system in Vietnam that provides a web and mobile application for customers for hotel bookings. It has only been in operation for nearly 1 year, and it provides the largest number of hotels in Vietnam. The company has successfully raised $3 million in its first round of foreign investment.
Quan trọng các nhà đầu tư quan tâm đến là cái định hướng của công ty cộng với cái đội ngũ đang vận hành, đang làm việc cùng công ty để có một cái quyết định đầu tư. Và một cái ví dụ cụ thể là các nhà đầu tư thì rất là quan tâm đến việc là có bao nhiêu khách hàng họ quay lại VnChip hơn là việc bạn có thêm bao nhiêu khách hàng mới.
Boasting over 1,500 startups, Vietnam has been listed as one of the most attractive host countries for foreign investment. Most recently, the 500 startups from the US Silicon Valley has announced a $10 million investment package for Vietnam. 2016 also marks the establishment of venture capitals and startup support programs in the country.
Cái vai trò có thể nói hàng đầu của nhà nước là đặc biệt quan trọng trong việc thiết kế một cách đồng bộ hệ thống hành lang pháp lý cũng như các cái cơ chế chính sách cần thiết, chủ động để phối hợp với các bộ ngành, các địa phương trong việc là xây dựng và triển khai các cái kết nối để thúc đẩy cho hoạt động đổi mới sáng tạo.
Earlier this year, Deputy Prime Minister Vũ Đức Đam approved a decision that aims to construct a Vietnamese startup ecosystem from now until 2025, also referred to as Program 844. First initiated in 2007, simulating the real Silicon Valley, their program will incorporate special incentives for startups such as co-working spaces, training activities, and tax and investment incentives.
Ở nước nào họ cũng có một cái như thế để mà thực sự để mà phong trào khởi nghiệp được phát triển thì nước nào họ cũng có một cái chương trình startup, ví dụ như startup Chile, startup Israel hay là startup Singapore, và chúng tôi cũng rất mừng có thể nói là 844 gần như là một cái gọi là startup Việt Nam.
Public-private partnership in building a startup ecosystem is the biggest change that Program 844 brings about. Though details of the program have not yet to be publicized, people are optimistic of its benefits.
Ban đầu là nhà nước đứng ra. Sau khi nhà nước đã có đầy đủ những cái kinh nghiệm, những kiến thức, có những quy định luật pháp rồi, nhà nước chỉ giữ vai trò là điều hành, nhà nước giữ vai trò tạo điều kiện, nhà nước giữ vai trò hỗ trợ về pháp lý. Và như vậy thì mới có thể thành công.
The program expects to deliver support for over 800 business projects for 200 startups by 2020, and the figure is expected to triple by 2025.
How do you assess the current business environment for startups in Vietnam? What are your predictions about the scale and the potential of development of the startup ecosystem in Vietnam?
I think it's fantastic. There's a strong ecosystem here. There's a number of co-working spaces, there's financing organizations, there's incubators, there's mentors. There's so many people and organizations that are making this place a wonderful place to create a startup. I think that Vietnam is starting to become known for startup companies, and so people are looking to Vietnam for new ideas, and I think that it's building momentum, and I think that we're going to see more of it in the future. My prediction is that it's going to continue to grow. I think we're going to see some really impressive companies coming out. We've already seen a number of fantastic companies, and I'm excited to see even more.
Mm-hmm. So what are your recommendations in, further develop such a startup ecosystem?
I think that something that really needs to be focused on is teaching those creative skills and critical thinking skills to young people, younger people in Vietnam. I'm talking high school or younger age, because it gets them to the point where once they graduate, they can use those skills to supplement what they study at university and create some exciting opportunities for Vietnam. And some of them will start startups, and some of them will work in other industries. But I think that creativity and critical thinking, if they're taught at a younger age, I think that they can really push forward the country, including startups and everything. I think it's fantastic. And already I've seen a number of programs that are pushing these skills, and it makes me really excited about the future.
Once again, thank you for joining our Bizline program.
Thank you for having me.
When starting a business, the fear of failing miserably can be paralyzing. However, failing is synonymous with learning. In a startup culture, It's clear that the failure of a company is not synonymous with the founder's failures, just the opposite. There are some advantages to being very vocal about mistakes. One important thing to remember is that owners are not their startup, and the possibility that they will eventually start another project is high. Learning from previous experiences, they can build a trajectory that has more value than just one of their endeavors. And that wraps up this edition of Bizline. Don't forget to log on to vtv4.vn and youtube.com/vtv4go to rewatch our program. Thank you very much for tuning in, and goodbye for now from Hanoi.